Saturn enters Aries on May 25th, 2025. It'll dip back into Pisces on September 1st, 2025, and then make its final lasting entry on February 14th, 2026. Now, according to the source material we're breaking down, these aren't just random dates on a calendar. They signal the start of what has historically been an incredibly volatile and transformative period. Okay, so let's get right into the core theory here. The source material doesn't treat this transit like some vague metaphor. No, it frames it as a collision of archetypal physics. You've got Saturn, which is all about structure, slowness, and building things to last. And then you have it moving into the territory of Aries, which is all about ignition, speed, and breaking things apart. It's a fundamental conflict, right? The force that builds walls slams into the force that shatters them. So to really get the mechanics, we have to look at this old Hellenistic idea called tapinoma, which basically means a planet's fall. Now, according to the ancient astrologer Ptolemy, this isn't about a planet being weak. It's about it being corrupted. See, Saturn is elementally cold and dry. It works by contracting things, slowing them down. Aries is the total opposite. It's hot and dry. It works by sparking things, speeding them up. So when Saturn hits Aries, it's like it goes into this thermal shock. Its normal tools just don't work. So it's forced to act out in a really distorted, coercive way. And this analogy on the slide just nails it. A planet in its fall is like a general who's deep in enemy territory and his supply lines have been cut. Now, what does a general do then? Saturn's goal is always order, but it can't use its usual playbook. Law, tradition, getting everyone to agree. It's forced to use the local resources. And in Aries, the local resources belong to Mars. We're talking about force, coercion, and doing things in a hurry. So, what's the bottom line? This is the crucial point. The outcome is structural brittleness. You'll see regimes and systems during a Saturn and Aries transit put on this big show of authoritarian strength, but it's a facade. Because that strength is built on force instead of actual support, they become incredibly fragile. They're prone to just snapping, a sudden and catastrophic collapse the second they come under real pressure. The 2nd century astrologer Vettius Valens, he adds another layer to this with a concept called enantiosis, or contrariety. He thinks of it as a guest-host conflict. You have Saturn, the guest, who is the master of time and delay, but he's staying in the house of Mars, the host, who is the master of severance and speed. This cosmic clash produces a pattern the source calls impulsive restriction. You know what that looks like? It's when governments use short-term, often violent fixes for deep, long-term problems. And this quote from Valens just perfectly illustrates what happens in the real world. He directly connects this astrological placement to the toppling of high places. And get this, he also says it relates to efforts that begin with great vigor, but end in ruin due to lack of foundation. It's the classic story of a poorly planned, aggressive project that just completely collapses under its own weight. Now, let's fast forward a few hundred years to see how this idea evolves. In the 17th century, the astrologer William Lilly gives us a more economic way to look at it. He says Saturn rules foundational things, the Earth itself, the metal lead, and foundational wealth, think bonds and real estate. Aries, on the other hand, rules ignition, fire, the head, the sword, and by extension, things like rampant inflation and wild speculation. Lilly's theory is that during this transit, the lead of Saturn basically melts in the fire of Aries. Foundational wealth gets destroyed. But here's a really important detail. It's not enough to just say Saturn is in Aries. The ancient astrologers were more precise. They divided each sign into little sections called terms or bounds, and each section has its own planetary ruler that colors how things play out. So in the first 6 degrees of Aries, ruled by Jupiter, we historically see things like religious splits or major legal shakeups like the Great Schism of 1054. The next bit, ruled by Venus, often lines up with alliances falling apart. But the real danger zone is between 21 and 25 degrees, the terms of Mars. Here Saturn is in Mars's sign and in Mars's own little slice of that sign. The data shows this is where you get the highest rate of actual kinetic warfare, with 410 CE and 1939 being prime examples. Okay, before we dive into all the historical examples, a real quick word on methodology. The analysis in this report isn't just guesswork. It's based on very precise astronomical calculations using something called the Swiss ephemeris, which even corrects for time distortions for ancient dates. And when they talk about the effective period of a transit, they mean the whole window from the first time Saturn enters Aries until the last time it leaves, including any backward or retrograde motion. Right. Let's walk through the history as the source compiled it.
The story begins with cycle C407, from 407 to 410, which is identified with the Roman collapse and the sack of Rome. Next up, C613, which marks the public rise of Islam. Then we have C731, a period of identity formation in Europe. C878 is flagged for the Alfredian defense, the fortification of Wessex in England. Then a huge one, C1054, the Great Schism, when the Catholic and Orthodox churches split for good. That's followed by C1201, when the Fourth Crusade ended up sacking the Christian city of Constantinople. C1319 saw major social unrest, and this section finishes with C1477, marked by the assassination of a king.
And the pattern just keeps going as we get into the modern era. C1584 lines up with the Anglo-Spanish War. C1702, the War of Spanish Succession. The cycle of C1790, that's the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror, almost to the day. C1849 brings the backlash to the 1848 revolutions. C1879, the Zulu War. Then you have C1908, the Balkan fuse that lit the fire for World War I. C1937 is impossible to miss, the start of total war with the invasion of Poland. C1967 marks the massive authority crisis of the late 60s. The most recent one, C1996, brought the Russian default and the Asian financial crisis. And that leads us right up to the doorstep of the next one, C2025, which the source labels the Aries vortex. So when you lay all that data out, the report says two big themes just jump out at you. It's not just bad times. It's a very specific type of crisis. The source labels them the partition of unity and the failure of the father archetype. Let's break down what that actually means. The absolute blueprint for this entire pattern is the collapse of Rome. In 407, right when Saturn hit Aries, the empire literally pulled back its borders, yanking legions out of Britain. Of course, this left the frontiers wide open to attack. The whole thing climaxed in 410 with Saturn in the final degrees of the sign, when the city of Rome itself was sacked for the first time in 800 years. And the core lesson from that event is just so profound. Saturn in Aries seems to signify that breaking point where the center can no longer hold the periphery. The empire, the structure, it becomes too brittle to maintain its own borders, and you get this violent shattering of its power. And listen, this isn't just about political empires. The transit also lands up with the splitting of huge ideological structures. In 1054, the Universal Church, this massive Saturnian structure of faith, was just ripped in two, creating the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Then, in the very next cycle, in 1204, that split was basically cemented in blood when the Fourth Crusade sacked the Christian city of Constantinople.
There's also this statistically weird correlation with regicide, the actual execution of monarchs, who are sort of the ultimate Saturnian father figures, right? In 1587, you have Mary, Queen of Scots, being executed. Then in 1793, Louis XVI is executed by guillotine. These events represent the symbolic death of the father, where the old authority isn't just overthrown, it's ceremonially destroyed by a new aggressive order.
So let's bring this into the 20th century. The 1937 to 1940 transit saw the total collapse of diplomacy. The League of Nations, a structure built for peace, was completely useless. The source uses this great term, glass cannon, to describe the Nazi war machine. It was built for incredibly rapid offensive attacks, total Aries energy, but it had no defensive staying power. A classic weakness of Saturn when it's in its fall. The 1967 to 69 period was a massive crisis of authority, and it was supercharged by the Uranus-Pluto conjunction happening at the same time. The theme was a straight-up clash between the old men, the established Saturnian government, and the youth, the Aryan counterculture. Things like the Tet Offensive, the assassinations of moral leaders like Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, they shattered the illusion that the old guard was in control. And finally, the most recent completed cycle, from 1996 to 99, showed up most clearly in the world of finance. The Asian financial crisis was all about rigid, pegged currencies. These are Saturnian structures that just broke under aggressive market attacks. And the Russian default in 1998 was the most literal expression you could ask for, a sovereign nation, the ultimate Saturn figure, publicly failing to pay its debts. And that leads us straight into the specific economic patterns this report highlights. The argument is that Saturn in Aries isn't just bad for the market or good for the market. It acts more like a volatility accelerant and a stress test for entire nations, forcing a kind of hard reset on the whole financial system. This table here is pretty compelling.
It cross-references the transit with hardcore economic data, and a pattern just pops right out. From 1839 to 41, you have the aftermath of a panic, where 9 U.S. states defaulted on their debt. From 1879 to 81, the U.S. goes back on the gold standard, causing a huge monetary contraction. In 1937, you get a policy-induced recession when the government tightens up too soon. And in 1998, a full-blown systemic banking crisis. The theme is always the same: broken promises and big policy shocks. And the speed of these crises is just breathtaking. They are not slow-motion train wrecks. They are sudden, shocking events. In the 1937 crash, the Dow lost almost half its value in just a matter of months. And the key thing is what triggered it: a Saturnian action. The Federal Reserve aggressively raised reserve requirements, a restrictive move that basically suffocated a fragile economic recovery. The report also has this really fascinating hypothesis about commodities and supply chains that feels incredibly relevant right now. It suggests that the wild price swings you see in things like food aren't caused by bad weather, but by politics messing with supply chains. The core idea is what they call supply chain brittleness. Our modern just-in-time delivery systems, which are built for Aryan speed, completely fall apart when they get hit with Saturnian restrictions, like a war, sanctions, or sudden border closures. All right, so this is what it has all been leading up to. The forecast for the next cycle, starting in 2025. The source calls this one the Aries vortex, and for good reason. It's not just Saturn and Aries this time. It's the conjunction of Saturn and Neptune, and it's happening at 0 degrees Aries, a critical point in the zodiac known as the world point. This is a big deal. Here are the dates you're going to want to watch. The first entry is May 25th, 2025. Then Saturn ducks back out into Pisces on September 1st. The final, locked-in entry is February 14th, 2026. But the absolute main event, according to this analysis, is 6 days later. On February 20th, 2026, Saturn and Neptune will meet at less than a single degree into Aries. Okay, let's get into the specific predictions. Prediction A is what's being called a crisis of truth. The mechanism is pretty clear. You've got Neptune, which dissolves boundaries and rules things like AI, deepfakes, and illusion, smashing into Saturn, which demands proof and builds walls. The predicted result is that the line between what's real and what's fake gets so blurry that it forces a hard, restrictive crackdown from governments. Think digital ID laws or national firewalls, the collapse of the open internet into a splinter net. Prediction B is geopolitical balkanization. Looking back at the historical pattern of empires breaking apart, like in 410 and 1939, the report predicts that a major supranational body, like NATO, the EU, or the Russian Federation, is going to face a major structural split. The idea is that the Saturn-Neptune conjunction dissolves the ideological glue that was holding these different groups together. The big risk is that we'll see conflict zones get partitioned, with new borders drawn by frozen military lines instead of actual peace treaties. Prediction C is all about a monetary reset. This transit is seen as the perfect storm for the rise of central bank digital currencies. You have the state, that's Saturn, trying to get its hands on and control the fluid, borderless world of crypto, which is very Neptune. The biggest risk identified here is a very high chance of a major sovereign debt crisis in 2026 or 27, as the bond markets finally wake up and reject what the report calls the illusion of never-ending debt. And finally, prediction D is something called a red swan event. That's a high-impact event that nobody sees coming. It comes from the combination of Neptune, which rules infection and water, with Saturn, which rules containment. In Aries, the theme is always the breaching of that containment. So this could look like a new biological threat, or maybe a massive cyber attack on critical water systems or maritime trade, with the source pointing to historical events like the Great Storm of 1703 as a precedent. So, to pull all this together, the report's conclusion is that the 2025 to 2028 window isn't just another dip in the market. It's being framed as a structural singularity, a moment where the combination of Saturn's fall and Neptune's dissolution, happening right at the start of the zodiac, signals a fundamental reset. So what do we do with all this? The analysis leaves us with 3 huge strategic takeaways. First, authority is brittle. Any government that's posturing and acting tough during this time is probably hiding extreme internal weakness. Second, the bond market is the thing to watch. History shows us that being over-leveraged gets punished, and it gets punished with brutal speed. And third, this period is going to rewrite the rules on what sovereignty even means, especially in the digital and biological worlds. And the report leaves us with this one last provocative question.
Is February 2026 just a single data point, or is it the event horizon for an entirely new 36-year geopolitical cycle? The period from May 2025 to January 2026 is presented as the tremor phase. That's when the first cracks start to show along the fault lines that are set to fully rupture when that conjunction hits. Now, for those of you who want to see the numbers behind all this, the report includes appendices for total transparency. This table from Appendix B, for instance, shows the precise dates for Saturn entering Aries all through the 20th and 21st centuries. You can see the entry, exit, and re-entry points for the 1908 and 1937 cycles, the cleaner single entries for 1967 and 1996, and of course, the upcoming one in 2025-26, followed by the next one way out in 2055. And finally, Appendix C just lists out those specific financial crises that form the backbone of the economic argument we've been talking about. This data really reinforces that link between these Saturn and Aries periods and times of major economic pain, from state defaults in the 1840s and deflation in the 1880s, all the way to the policy screw-ups of the 1930s and the systemic crises of the late 1990s.